and welcome members and guests to this evening's webinar. It's a very interesting topic, and I noticed that several of our friends from the Maritime Museum have also joined us today. So thank you very much for your interest. And on behalf of the chairman and the trustees of the CSMBS and the Director General, Mr. Sabyasachi Mukherjee, and on behalf of the Executive Committee of the Museum Society and all of us present here this evening, thank you so much, Urna, for acceding to our request and so readily agreeing to give us a talk. It must be impinging on your time, but I hope you will find this time well utilized. I know that you're registered for your PhD. So we're looking forward to today's talk. And then when you finally complete your PhD, we're looking forward to the all the acts put together. So I must thank our good friend, Dr. Annie Buddle, a good friend of all of us here and the CSMVS and members of the Museum Society for introducing you to us. And I greatly appreciate she's always looking out for interesting speakers like you to address us here in Mumbai. So thank you very much for speaking to us on this fascinating topic, especially for us who live in Bombay, the Bombay Dockyard, to the great exhibition, Indian Shipbuilding in the Times of the British Empire. A few words about our charming young speaker for this evening. Urna Mukherjee is a doctoral graduate in the Department of History of Science and Technology at the Johns Hopkins University in the US. She did her BA honors in English literature from St. Stephen's College, Delhi, and her MA and her MPhil in modern Indian history at the Center for Historical Studies at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. She is currently Andrew W. Mellon Fellow at the Rijksmuseum in Netherlands, conducting, and I quote, an object-based research involving the art and cultural history of the Low Countries, close quote. Looking forward to hearing more about that. Her doctoral dissertation is on the history of technologies, which we will see, material cultures of shipbuilding in the early modern Indian Ocean region, focusing on shipyards of European companies on the coastal lines of South Asia and their use of local and indigenous labor, technology, expertise, and resources during the 17th to the 19th century. And I'm not going to give away any more about what we're going to hear, but let it suffice. Some of these names that you're going to speak about, like the Parsi shipwright Lauji Nasarwanji, who left Surat and came to Bombay under the English East India Company in 1736, and who began a generation of Wadia men as master builders in the Bombay Dockyard, is a story we're more or less familiar with, but we're looking forward to your academic research. And of course, under the technical organization of the Wadias, the help of local and indigenous and migrant labor, how these ships were built here in the mid-19th to early 20th centuries, or mid-18th to early 20th centuries. And of course, we know they really sailed the oceans of the known world at that time, and they were quite courageous. I won't use a stronger word like buccaneers, but very interesting history of India and the empire. And welcome, Urna, and welcome for taking the time out. And you will see me at the end, but I would like to thank you now. I would also like to thank Jason Johns and the technical team for always supporting us. And Jason will, of course, be giving the vote of thanks and fielding the Q&A. So guests attending, please put your answers, request you to put your questions in the chat box for Urna Mukherjee to throw light on your queries. And as you all know, we throw the end of the evening open for an informal chit-chat like we do at the museum after our talks. So thank you everyone for being with us. And thank you those who are our members, those who are members of other societies for joining us this evening. So over to you, Jason, and let's hear about shipbuilding and the master shipbuilders from this part of the world. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm assuming most of my audience are currently in India, so it's evening for you, it's afternoon for me. I would like to start by thanking Dr. Godrej and Dr. Johns profusely for helping arrange this, for inviting me to speak here to begin with. I feel like it's an immense privilege to be able to speak to the members of the Museum Society of Mumbai and the people of the CSMVS, as well as other guests who are attending today, and present to you all my research, which is in its very early stages at this point, but something that I'm very excited about. And I'm really looking forward to the Q&A session and to hear all your questions, your feedback, everything that you might have to say, all your impressions on the talk that you're about to hear. So to give a little bit of context, and Dr. Godrej had very wonderfully introduced my broader research project to you. So what I'm exploring is a history of the technology and material cultures of shipbuilding along the Western Indian Ocean region between the late 17th and early 19th centuries. For this, I'm focusing on three colonial shipyards, the Bombay Dockyard, which I'm going to talk about today, the Ribeira Grande at Goa, and the Timor Wharf in Cochin under the Dutch rule, which is what I am currently studying for my fellowship at the Rijksmuseum in Netherlands, which I'm happy to talk about more if you would like that later on. I'm looking at the various British, Portuguese, and Dutch and their Indian collaborators, material and technological investments in shipbuilding in these regions through a study of labor, technological expertise, design and technique, resources and raw materials used in the construction of ocean-going and coastal vessels in these centers. So between trade and military naval conflict, this is a period when labor and expertise, as well as raw materials in the Indian Ocean that were local to the region, were very central and constant to the maintenance and upkeep of the various European and Indian Ocean merchants and navies. And I feel like the reason I'm interested in this is because I feel like it brings forward certain nodes of encounters between European and Indian technological knowledge and observances, which offer space for exploring the circulation and exchange of technologies that of geographically very distant regions of the world. And with that, I'm going to start sharing my screen and we can get into my presentation, which is going to be on the Bombay Dockyard. And I have charted it as a sort of exploration of the movement of shipbuilding technology from the Bombay Dockyard to the Great Exhibition, which is how I have organized the presentation. And I hope you'll find something interesting in it. So to get into it, I'll start with giving a little bit of background to the Bombay Dockyard, which I'm sure a lot of people, especially those in the Maritime Society and the Museum Society and CSMVS, would be very familiar with, which is the establishment of the Bombay Dockyard, which I find is also a very interesting story. So the English had been considering building vessels at Bombay since as early as the 1660s, when the principal shipbuilding port that was closest to them was Surat. The earliest reference we have of the English East India Company getting ships of war built at Surat is 1673. However, with the transfer of their headquarters from Bombay to Surat in 1687, there was increasing consensus among company officials on the potential advantage of building ships in Bombay. The Surat consultations of 1668 point out that timber, ironwork, carpenters, and many raw materials for building ships were much cheaper at Bombay. Contemporary British accounts claim that before 1735, there were no docks in Bombay. I have my own thoughts about that, and I think that's something that we can definitely discuss during the Q&A. But to move on with the story, in 1735, an agent of the English East India Company was allegedly so impressed by the work of the Parsi foreman by the name of Lauji Nasarwanji in Surat that his report obliged the Bombay government to offer to bring Lauji to Bombay to work in the establishment of the dockyard on the island. In 1736, he finally moved and assisted in the building of a 90-foot grab. 5 years after his arrival, the English master carpenter of the island died before he could complete the vessel they were building. Lauji completed the task to the satisfaction of the Bombay Council and earned himself and his family the patronage of the company in matters of shipbuilding for decades to come. His family, as I'm sure a lot of us know, eventually came to adopt the moniker Wadia from the Gujarati term for shipbuilder. I find the Gujarat coast and Surat connection particularly interesting because I feel like it serves as a sort of genealogy of the technology of shipbuilding that was passed on from generations of various Parsi shipbuilding families that finally sort of found a sort of fruition with the Wadias in Bombay. We know from English East India Company records that they were building ships for private merchants in Surat by other Parsi shipbuilders. In fact, an observation from 1689 makes note that, and I quote, "The ship carpenters at Surat will take the model of any English vessel in all the curiosity of its building and the most artificial instances of workmanship about it, as if exactly that they had been the first contriver. The wood with which they built their ships would be very proper for our men of war in Europe, for it has this excellence that it never splinters by the force of a bullet, nor is injured by those violent impressions beyond the bore of a shot." Close quotations. This reflection on the shipbuilders of Surat lends the impression that they were experts at imitating and recreating ships built in England with their native material to a degree of indistinguishable perfection. I use the air quotes for imitating because I think that's a very loaded term and is something that I keep grappling with as I study my archival sources. So there are also later accounts concerning the Wadia builders in the 18th century in Bombay, which also use a similar kind of language in talking about the excellence of their shipbuilding, that they were experts at imitating the style of English-built ships, or that they had learned so perfectly from the English shipbuilders that they could recreate English-style ships entirely. And I think that's a very that's a statement that definitely needs to be viewed with a lot of skepticism. Regardless of what these European English perceptions of the Parsis and the Wadia's shipbuilding technology and skills were, I think one thing is clear, and that is that Lauji and his artificers from Surat knew the ships that the English sailed in so thoroughly and intimately that they were able to build ships that the English preferred and would be happy with, and were able to pass down that knowledge to successive generations of Wadia builders at the Bombay Dockyard, as they continued to be employed by the company and private merchants for the next century. We don't have any existing artistic depictions of the Bombay Dockyard from this period. However, here's an excerpt from the travelogue of Abraham Parsons, where he describes the dockyard thus, and it's a longish quote, but I think I would like to read it out because it gives a very graphic and sort of visually easy to recreate description of the space. Begin open quotes. "Here is a dockyard, large and well contrived, with all kind of naval stores deposited in proper warehouses, together with great quantities of timber and planks for repairing and building ships, and forges for making of anchors, as well as every kind of smaller smith's work. It boasts such a dry dock as perhaps is not to be seen in any part of Europe, either for size or convenient situation. It has 3 divisions and 3 pair of strong gates, so as to be capable of receiving and repairing 3 ships of the line at the same time or at separate times, as the outermost ship can warp out and another be admitted in her place every spring tide, without any interruption of the work doing to the second and innermost ships. Or both the outermost and second ship can go out and 2 others be received in their places without hindrance to the workmen employed on the third and innermost ship. Near the dock is a convenient place to grave several ships at once, which is done as well and with as great expedition as in any dock in England. Near the dockyard is a rope walk, which for length, situation, and conveniency equals any in England, that in the King's Yard at Portsmouth only excepted, and like that, it has a covering to shelter the workmen from the inclemency of the weather in all seasons. End quote. This largish paragraph, I think, gives a very clear sense of how impressed the viewer was with the layout of the dockyard. The constant comparisons to European dockyards, to English dockyards, and the assertions that this probably far exceeds any English dockyard that the narrator had seen is also something that is very striking. And this is also a refrain that keeps getting repeated in the archival material when it comes to the Bombay dockyard. There is a very clear admiration among any visiting Europeans or any visitor from any part of the world who are incredibly charmed by the Wadia's skill at shipbuilding, as well as the way they have constructed and organized the dockyard. Their ships were also technically like going all over the world. So it's not just people from all over the world coming and visiting the Bombay dockyard, but also the Bombay dockyard in some form going out into the world in the form of the ships that were being built there. And that is the part of the circulation of technology story that I am interested in. Their ships would be used for cargo and freight, transoceanic voyages, and wars fought by the British in North America, China, Persia, Burma, and Crimea. The middle of the 18th century saw a marked increase in shipbuilding for the Bombay Marine to engage in routine marine battles with both other European and various Indian Ocean seafaring communities. These 2 paintings of the HMS Minden and the HMS Wellesley, which were both constructed in the Bombay dockyard, are examples of the ships that were being built by the Wadias in the Bombay dockyard that were being used by the British all over the world for purposes of maintaining their empire. And we have these grand depictions of naval battles that sort of give evidence to the fact that here was the ship that was built in Bombay that was in all these different parts of the world partaking in this enterprise. The shipbuilding industry at the Bombay dockyard itself was, from all accounts, a completely Wadia family affair, with seemingly all-encompassing control of the Wadias over the shipbuilding process. So one of the scholarly works that was very helpful in trying to understand what was going on was Ratanjee Ardeshir Wadia's 1955 History of the Origins of His Family, and their work at the Bombay dockyard where he lists the names of master builders, assistant builders, and dockyard assistants, which show that all these positions were filled by various individuals sharing the Wadia name. Generations of young Wadia men seem to join at the dockyard from an early age as assistants and train under their senior relatives who were builders, thereby bringing up the sons of the family under the profession. The Wadias also seem to have a great deal of control of labor, and a majority of the raw materials that were used for the shipbuilding enterprise from the very outset. This is also something that is very interesting to me because it seems like the Wadia's intervention in the labor sourcing and the raw material sourcing process makes the Bombay Dockyard stand out, especially if I compare it to the Ribeira Grande in Goa and the Timor Wharf in Cochin, and definitely gives it a different dimension in understanding the history of this kind of a Indo-European dockyard in this period of time. They seemed very personally involved from the beginning of the process to the end, from organizing the supply of timber for building to inspecting the ships upon completion. This is, of course, not to say that the British government at Bombay did not have ultimate control and authority over the shipbuilding at the Bombay Dockyard. For instance, when there was scarcity of timber in the Bombay, a year after Lauji's arrival, the Bombay government had sent him, and I quote, to the north to negotiate for a supply from the natives in the forest, end quote. All items not locally procured were imported by the government, and the imported items were regulated and supplied from the company's warehouses. As the Angryas, one of the maritime rivals of the British, began making efforts to buy gallivants in Bombay, the government issued a proclamation prohibiting the sale of any vessels without the government's permission. There was clearly that sort of a premium put on the ships and the resources building the ships as important resources for the British to maintain their hold over Bombay Island, as well as continue their power across the Indian Ocean region. One of the things that also then becomes interesting is to see what about the ships built in Bombay Dockyard was so unique and valuable. And one of the first things that I came across while looking into the archives was the mentioning of the rabbiting work that they did on the bottom of the vessel. So a rabbit joint is something that is like best described as one of the joints that I have displayed on the screen here. And this kind of like joining of planks was a very popular way of building ships from the bottom of the keel up to the top of the hull during the age of wooden sailing ships. And the Wadia built ships were particularly well known for their rabbiting work that they did on the bottom of the vessel. And it was argued that their particular style of rabbiting was what gave a great amount of durability and longevity to their ships. British observers claimed, and I quote, "The planks forming the bottom are so nicely joined, or to use the proper scientific term, fade together, as to render caulking almost unnecessary." Caulking is a kind of process where the joints of the planks are sealed with a kind of liquid sealant that that will harden afterwards so that the surface becomes waterproof. So depending on the place and the time, caulking can be done by tar or pitch or wax or a mixture of some kind of chemical sludge. But the fact that it is being claimed that their rabbit work itself was apparently so tightly interlocked that even like it's almost not necessary to even use a sealant on top is something very remarkable. Their enthusiasm for this particular feature of these ships can be attributed to the protection and preservation that this technique provided the bottoms of the ships by ensuring, and I quote, "the exclusion of the water and the almost total prevention of its insinuation between the joints." So, like the previous speaker said, almost waterproof. The Wadia's rabbiting work supposedly rendered the bottoms of their ships almost immune to water damage and gave them the reputation of being unusually long-lasting. The lower hull of one of the ships that they built, the 74-gun Cornwallis of 1813, here described on the left, here depicted on the left as the model of the ship Cornwallis, and next to it in the painting. It was used, so this ship was built in 1813, and it survived in use as a depot ship and floating jetty at Sheerness up until 1957. So almost like not completely 150 years, but definitely more than 100 years. Apparently, it was still so strong at the time in which it was finally broken up, that it had to be broken up using explosives. A model of the Cornwallis, the one depicted here, built by Jamsetjee's son at the same time as the ship, is currently the largest sailing warship model in the National Maritime Museum collection in Greenwich. Another famous example of their use of this technology was in the construction of the 1784 East Indiaman, Sir Edward Hughes, depicted here on the right. It's a detail from a watercolor, which is the only depiction of the Edward Hughes that I could find. Apparently, the shipwrights of Bombay Dockyard had built water tanks or cisterns into the vessels using the same kind of rabbeting work that made these tanks watertight, saved stowage for water baths or casks, and reduced a lot of manual labor. The ship had a long and varied career of nearly 80 years, being used as a country ship, an ocean-going cargo ship, a 38-gun frigate, and a store ship during the Napoleonic Wars, a coal depot, a hulk, and even a convict ship between 1784 and 1869. So the longevity and durability of the ships built by the Wadias in the Bombay Dockyard is something that repeatedly gets mentioned, and clearly something that makes it so popular. Because the English-made ships do not seem to be lasting this long. I mean, even in my study of ships made by the VOC, the average lifespan of a ship, a well-built ship, seems to be anywhere between 20 to maybe a maximum of 30 years, not more than that, like especially a wooden sailing ship, that is. So in comparison to that, for a ship from the Bombay Dockyard to last from anywhere between 80 to 150 years is something that is quite remarkable. Another feature of the ships built at the Bombay Dockyard that was lauded was their use of teak wood as building material. Numerous English visitors to Bombay, from government officials to leisure travelers to men of science, would eulogize for over a century about the merits of teak as building materials for ships, to the point that it began appearing almost as an extraordinary material. I'll read out like one of these descriptions of how they are talking about teak wood. Open quotes. The teak timber of which they are constructed lasts much longer than any other wood. The worm will not eat it, and it is supposed to be from the same cause that the iron bars do not corrode it. An oil remaining in the timber, the smell and taste of which the former do not like, while it prevents the rust of iron. End quotes. So Bombay, being so close to the Malabar forests, was therefore a very good place to then source Malabar teak from, which apparently had been found to have superior qualities for shipbuilding. Its natural oils acted as preservatives, and it was found more resilient to extreme climates than the traditional shipbuilding wood for the English, which is the English oak. Furthermore, teak also required less seasoning, which cuts the time between the harvest and use and is highly resistant to wood-boring insects and shipworm attacks. In the early 19th century, the Malabar teak forests beginning just north of Bombay shipyard were replete with mature trees of the ideal size for shipbuilding, to the extent that the ships built for the Royal Navy in Bombay often came complete with a duplicate set of frames, which would be used to build a further vessel. As all of Europe faced timber shortages following the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, and Britain suffered a famine in the aftermath of the war against revolutionary France in 1793, teak-built ships from the Wadia's dockyard carrying rice and wheat sailed up the Thames and impressed the British Admiralty with both the quality of its timber and its construction. This encouraged the company to begin annually commissioning ships of war at the Bombay Dockyard for the use of the Admiralty. One incredible material evidence of the durability of this teak wood and of the durability of the Wadia-built ships is what I'm going to talk about next. And the section of teak that I have shown here from 1817 is actually part of the original, one of the original planking of the ship, the HMS Trincomalee, which still exists, having been built in 1817. It is currently now a museum ship in Hartlepool in UK. The HMS Trincomalee is an artifact of maritime technology that I also use in my work to study the history of shipbuilding in the Bombay Dockyard by looking at the studies that have already been done and by looking at the records that exist of the ship itself. The Trincomalee is the last remaining ship built for the Royal Navy in India during the first half of the 19th century. Now it is a museum ship in a wet dock at the National Museum of the Royal Navy in Hartlepool. There are many evidences of its Indian heritage that we will go into as we view the next slides. And a lot of recent investigations have also sort of, in recent years, have revealed what exactly this means in terms of the history of the ship itself, the history of different parts of the ship, and the history of its construction and its repair and its maintenance. Currently, we know very little about the construction of the HMS Trincomalee, other than what is evident in the vessel today. We know from records, for instance, that on 29th May 1816, a silver nail ceremony took place for the HMS Trincomalee. It was a tradition held at the Bombay shipyard, possibly Parsi in origin, where a silver nail was driven into the stern of the keel before being lowered into its mortise. This marked the beginning of the construction of the ship. This ceremony was described in the Asiatic Journal of January 1820, whereby it was described that a Parsi priest blessed the nail with frankincense, rosewater, and distributed sweetmeats among the guests and builders of the vessels who had to wear special robes for the ceremony. The silver nail ceremony seems to be unique to the Bombay Yard, but it is not clear whether it was performed for every ship built there or whether it was performed only for the HMS Trincomalee. What is interesting, however, are these design features that we can see on the hull of the ship with whether it's the decorative floral motifs, whether it's the elephant head, or as we go further into the ship, we find other evidences of its very specific origin. One of the things that struck me, for instance, was how instantly and visibly one could tell the difference between where the original ship's construction is and where new constructions or repairs have been made. I really want to thank the curator of this museum ship, Claire Hunt, for helping me with this, because she was very helpful in showing me around the ship and pointing all these different aspects of the ship to me and sharing a lot of information about the ship's history that she had in her possession. And from her, I also found out that about 60% of the HMS Trincomalee is the original material that it sailed with from Bombay in 1817. And you can see from these photographs how visibly different the original teak planking is and the replacement oak is. The color of the wood is different, the graining is different. Teak has a much thicker and denser and smaller grain compared to oak, which is also apparently what makes it more durable and makes it easier to work with. One of the conservators at the Rijksmuseum, who I had been talking with about this, told me the same thing in her experience of carving wood for conservation of furniture pieces or ship model pieces. She had first-hand experience of how incredibly fluid it is to work with teak when, because of the small grains, when one is sawing through a plank of teak, there is much less chance that it will splinter or break unevenly, and it's incredibly easy to work with. So this floor, for instance, is from the captain's cabin, and it's, like I said, it's very easily discernible where it meets the teak, which is reddish in color. The oak in several places, like as you can see on the image on the left, have also suffered like cracking and damage from furniture beetle or woodworm. And there are other pockets of decay that it has experienced, which is not the case with the teak. So, which really lends credence to the claims about the durability of teak as a shipbuilding wood. And this is another aspect of the ship that is so fascinating. So from the on the left, what you have the images of the outer sheathing of the hull of the ship, which has been replaced, which is part of the 40% of the ship that has been repaired and replaced with new material. But on the left, the images of the inner sheathing of the hull, this is practically at the very bottom of the ship, like under the waterline. And this is all original material. And this is because one of the things that, one of the strategies of shipbuilding that they used was to have a double sheathing where an outer sheathing was placed, which would be damaged over the years and could be replaced and repaired. And there would be an inner sheathing, which would be really strong and maintain the internal structure of the ship. And they would leave a certain amount of space between the inner and the outer sheathing for air circulation. And that is apparently another thing that would really help prevent the growth of mold or encourage any kind of dampness by making sure that there was an air circulation between the different layers of the sheathing. The green part that you see here is the copper sheathing that was added later to prevent greater damage to the hull. This is another aspect of the ship that indicates to its Indian origins. Now, this is something that we don't have very concrete evidence for, but it is believed that this particular kind of like barley sugar twist design of stanchions is a very typical Wadia family trademark. We don't have evidence of such decorative features in other Royal Navy or English East India Company ships of that period, at least the ones that had survived. We also don't see this in any of the ship models that came out of the Bombay Dockyard. However, it is suggested that this is a very typical feature of the ships built at the Bombay Dockyard. And finally, the figurehead, which has a very interesting story to tell as well. So despite the skills available in Bombay, and we know that there were figurehead carvers at the Bombay Dockyard, they were most often not used to install the figureheads on the ships that were built at the Bombay Dockyard. The ships, a lot of ships would be built in the Bombay Dockyard, which would not have figureheads on it till it arrived in England, where the Royal Navy's ships, shipyards would supply with the figurehead. Sometimes the figureheads were also shipped from England, having been designed and made by the dockyard's carvers. The Trincomalee's figurehead was commissioned from Overton and Company in 1813, when her order was first made, and eventually arrived in October 1818, just as she was about to sail for England. The one on the left is actually the second figurehead. The first figurehead does not survive. And this was also constructed in England, designed by Hellyer and Son, and installed in 1846. This figurehead survives at the National Museum of the Royal Navy in Hartlepool, having remained on the ship until its restoration in the 1990s, when the new figurehead was put up, which is the one that we see on the left, on the right. There's a very interesting myth associated with it, which is that the figurehead is a portrait of the ship's builder, Jamsetjee Bomanjee Wadia. However, the figureheads, I mean, there is no evidence that this was a depiction of him. Figureheads in the same style had come both before and after the Trincomalees, and the designers were English, so it is highly unlikely that they would have known what Jamsetjee Bomanjee would have looked like, especially in the 1840s, when it would have been constructed, since Jamsetjee Bomanjee had passed away in 1821. However, this allows me to go into the next section of my presentation, where I go more from looking at the very physical material evidence and like doing a more enumerative study, to asking questions about what this material evidence and what the depiction and descriptions mean. Because even in the story of the figureheads, I think it's very interesting that the English East India Company or the Royal Navy were okay with having ships constructed at the Bombay Dockyard, but insisted on having figureheads being constructed in England and either shipped to Bombay or have the ship travel to England and get the figurehead attached. There seems to be something symbolic about this, and a sort of like establishment of ownership, perhaps, or this is something that we can talk about. But to move on to talking about, like, you know, what images and what depictions mean. I'll go on to the next slide. And this is, of course, the shipbuilder who was just mentioned, Jamsetjee Bomanjee Wadia, the one who was the master shipbuilder at the time of the Trincomalee's construction. He's considered to have been the most talented of the Wadias, several generations of whom had been at this point employed by the East India Company. Jamsetjee garnered a great deal of respect from the Admiralty and was entrusted to build the first Royal Navy ship of the line outside of England, the HMS Minden, which is depicted in the painting right next to Jamsetjee's portrait, in 1810. Jamsetjee's skills combined with the qualities of the Malabar teak were something that was highly valued and shows in the kind of like descriptions that we find of the ships that were built when he was the master shipbuilder of the yard. There are also these very interesting legends about his personality that make the existence of his portrait itself a very interesting phenomenon. So one of the interesting stories that I came across about him was that he was extremely proud of his work and was very aware of the patronizing and superior behavior of the British in India, and had often been party to offensive language used by the British. So he supposedly carved a secret message into the timbers of one of his ships, I don't know which one, which read, and I quote, "This ship was built by a damned black fellow, AD 1800, unquote." We don't know the truth of this, but the existence of this story, like I said, makes the existence of a portrait like this very interesting. This is because this portrait comes in a set. It's thought to be posthumous and based on an engraving made in 1812 after a miniature by the artist Edward Nash. In the engraving, the shawl that we see in the portrait is missing. A matching portrait of the sitter's son, Naroji Jamsetjee Wadia, was also made by the artist of this painting. And this, together with another version of the present picture, are currently in the Museum of London on loan from the Royal Asiatic Society. Both are in the same rectangular frame, with Naroji on the left, similarly seated but facing the viewers on the right, holding a stern view draft of the 84-gun Asia, which he built for the Royal Navy in Bombay Dockyard in 1822 to 24. Now, to go back to Jamsetjee Bomanjee's portrait, of course, we mentioned the shawl that he's wearing in the portrait that was supposedly absent in the engraving. Apparently, it was customary for shipbuilders to be given shawls by the representative of the East India Company at the launching of a new ship. But the thing that interests me the most about this particular painting are these four details. The ship in the background, presumably the HMS Minden being constructed. The plan of the HMS Minden in a scroll in Jamsetjee's right hand, along with what might be assumed to be a scale rule for measurement atop the table he's resting his hand on. The compass divider in his left hand, and some kind of case or sleeve, presumably for his instruments, tucked in his kamarband. Now, since it is believed that the portrait was made posthumously, and he was succeeded by his son Naroji Jamsetjee Wadia, it might be speculated that it was Naroji Jamsetjee who commissioned the portraits to be made thus. We don't have any information, or at least I don't have any information, on how much control Naroji Jamsetjee would have had over the details of portraiture if indeed he was the one who commissioned these portraits. However, the inclusion and placement of these details is fascinating and significant to me. Here is arguably the most famous Indian shipbuilder in the British Empire of that time, dressed in his native regalia and carrying on his person and about him the tools of his profession. Or at least that is the message that the painting seemingly wants to convey. For the question of the Indian shipbuilder's craft and technology, is the viewer of the portrait meant to understand this as a representation of Indian shipbuilding craft and technology, the divider, the scale, the plan? Can we presume that the same instruments and methods were used by the Wadias in Bombay as those used by the shipbuilders in Europe? And I would hesitate to say that that was the case, because even in Europe, the use of ship plans as blueprints to build ships was also a relatively new thing. It wasn't until the 19th century that they started using ship plans. Ship models were used more popularly before to provide concepts of ships being built. But here is this 19th century portrait of this Indian shipbuilder who is dressed completely identifiable as an Indian man, but with these European markers of shipbuilding technology. So it seems to me that it is meant to convey Jamsetjee Bomanjee in a light that would have been understandable to a very particular audience, that is, a European one. Scientific and mathematical tools in art have a very long precedent. As we can see in these very famous paintings from the 17th century, the geographer by Johannes Vermeer holding a divider, the shipbuilder Jan Eriksson and his wife Greta Jans by Rembrandt van Rijn also holding a divider and presumably working on a ship plan. So given the fact that there is a genealogy of using scientific instruments to convey a certain message to the viewer of paintings about the, especially portraits, about the subject of the portrait, I think it's very fascinating what the portrait of Jamsetjee Bomanjee Wadia does with him holding those kinds of instruments, like incorporating this kind of an iconography. And this is not the only thing that I'm interested in terms of like the message that is being conveyed through the representation and depiction of, say, representatives of the Bombay Dockyard, for lack of a better term, Jamsetjee Bomanjee being the shipbuilder, but also in terms of the ships themselves as conveying a sort of design message. And not just the ships, because because especially at the beginning of the 19th century and the end of the 18th century, we see ship models being increasingly sent from the Bombay Dockyard to England. And that is what the next part of my presentation is going to talk about. Ship modeling as a technology, of course, is as old as shipbuilding itself. And ship models provide us with a lot of valuable insight and information regarding seafaring technology and the sociological and economic importance of seafaring. Ship models built during the 17th and 18th centuries, particularly those attached to the various East India companies, often had a range of purposes attached to them. Shipwrights who were in charge of constructing ships would often also construct ship models to show prospective customers how the full-size ship would appear. These ship models were also often used to illustrate advanced building techniques to educate civilians who were involved in the financing or some other aspect of the ship. To avoid construction errors that might have evolved as the ship itself took form, as well as in educating prospective shipwrights, ship carpenters, and apprentices. These were also useful for maritime artists as a point of reference to illustrate their paintings and prints of ships with a certain degree of technical accuracy. Further, ship models were used for display purposes at chambers of admiralties and offices of East India companies as prestige items meant to signify economic and political power. This is especially the case for the very grand ship models that we see in the various maritime museums in Europe in the present day, for instance. So it is interesting in this context to see how the shipbuilders of the Bombay Dockyard began conveying ship design through ship models in the European style in the early 19th century. A sizable collection of ship models were built by master carpenters and apprentices of the Bombay shipyard, in the beginning of the 19th century, and many of them found their way into the Great Exhibition of 1851 in the Crystal Palace. So if we look at the guide to the Great Exhibition, like where it's cataloged, like where the different pavilions are cataloged, when we come to the India Pavilion, one of the things that gets mentioned are these ship models. And I'll quote from the guide at this point, open quotes, among which we may specify the model of an Arab Bagla built at Bombay with a regular stern of a British vessel and with quarter galleries very handsomely carved, and a model of an almost extinct vessel called the Dawn. Close quotation. So I started looking for these ship models that were displayed at the Great Exhibition, and I was able to find at least 4 of them, though I'm convinced that there are more. And these 4 currently are in the possession of the Science Museum in the UK, in London. I was unable to see the actual models because the Science Museum is currently having some kind of a shift of their repositories. So their collection is closed for viewing until, I think, sometime in 2024. However, I was able to go to the library and access a lot of information about these ship models that were displayed in the Great Exhibition that came from the Bombay Dockyard. And I was surprised to find that a lot of them were not even East Indiamen that were built for the British, but more local native vessels. For instance, this vessel that I have put on the screen here is that of of a trading vessel that was traditionally used between the Gulf of Kutch and Bombay. And this is something that was displayed in the Great Exhibition from the Bombay Dockyard. Another one was this model of a buttle, which was, fortunately, we know who built it. The name was mentioned, a certain Dirjiboy Mirwanji in the Bombay Dockyard. And this was also displayed in the Great Exhibition. The interesting thing that I realized about some of these models is that after the display was done, for a long time, it seems that the models were the whereabouts of these models were not known. But sometime around the end of the 19th century, a huge donation is made from Prince Albert's personal collection to the King's College, London. And these models find their way in that collection. And it's not until the Science Museum is opened in the early 20th century that negotiations begin about acquiring these models for display in the Science Museum, which is when these models also start getting studied. So these, the scale drawings that we have of the cross sections of the models, of the plan of the model, are actually post the creation of the model and not something that was done before the models were created. These drawings were done to study the shape and design of the model, which shows the interest that survived even a century or so after the models were constructed in the Bombay Dockyard, in the sort of technology that was used in local and native seafaring crafts of that region. This is another model that came up, and the fascinating thing about this, there are actually two fascinating things about this model. This is also a model of a ship that was apparently very prevalent in the Western Indian Ocean region, but would eventually like stop being used by the end of the 19th century. Though not from Bombay or even from the western coast of India, but more from the Persian Gulf region, the Bombay Dockyard clearly decided to make a model of this and send it to the Great Exhibition. And what is fascinating to me is that, first of all, the incredible amount of detail that they put in the interior of the ship model. This is something that in my viewing of ship models throughout Europe at this point, it's very rare to come by. The level of detail that they have put in creating the interior is extraordinary. And the second thing that struck me was the particular kind of anchor that is used, which is more like a grappling hook than the two-sided anchor that we are used to seeing anchors as. And the fascinating thing about the reason this is even more fascinating is because here's this vessel that was originally from the Persian Gulf region. And yet the Bombay Dockyard shipbuilders seem to know that they used a very particular kind of grappling hook anchor. We also see this anchor in another ship model that allegedly came from India, but we don't know its exact origins because the museum currently in its possession, the National Maritime Museum, they don't have any good provenance records of where it came from. They bought it from a vendor, and very recently at that. But here also is a grappling hook kind of an anchor, which I thought was very interesting. Especially because this is a very particular geographical feature. These kind of anchors developed in places where the seabed or the riverbed where these vessels would be navigating were more muddy than rocky, and they needed better grip to keep the vessel in place. And a grappling hook anchor of this shape would be more convenient to use that rather than just a two-sided anchor, which is more popularly used in different parts of the world. Even other than these native crafts, like there is a huge collection of ship models built in the Bombay Dockyard that eventually found its way into England, which are also, I think, worth studying. So this one, for instance, is the Scaleby Castle. It's a contemporary full hull model of an East Indiaman cargo vessel built in what is called the bread and butter fashion, which has been gauged out internally, producing a wooden shell of about ½ inch in thickness. The model is decked and partially equipped and includes the wheel, hatch gratings, and 3 stump masts. So the stump masts I thought were a very interesting feature because the stump masts are clearly not to scale, which makes me then wonder that, is this a model that would have been created for the purposes of emphasizing a different set of design features, the hull, for instance, or the keel shape and size? Like, is this what this model is trying to convey? And so they did not like invest much on building masts or rigging or sails so as to not take attention away from the feature that they want the viewer to focus on. But that is, of course, my speculation. Like, the trouble with these objects is that there is almost no written documentation of their origin, of their purchase. Like, we are lucky if we know where it came from. And sometimes we do know where it came from, especially in the case of these ship models that came from Bombay Dockyard, which at least helps us establish some degree of cultural heritage, so to speak. So the ship itself, the Scaleby Castle, was built in Bombay and launched in 1798. It was built completely of teak and had a career spanning 43 years. The painting that of the ship that I have displayed here is currently at the National Maritime Museum collection, and so is the model. The model forms part of the James Caird collection and was apparently previously part of the Nautical Training School collection. So that is how this model sort of changed hands. And the fact that it was part of the Nautical Training School collection is also something very interesting to me, because it seems like whether it is like for display purposes or whether it was for educational purposes, clearly there was value attached to collecting and having these models and keeping them. The same is the case with this particular model. We have literally no information on this other than that it was a model of a 36-gun frigate and it was made by an apprentice in the Bombay Dockyard. This again is in the collection of the Portsmouth Naval Dockyard, which signifies the importance of objects like these and the importance of continuing to preserve and keep objects like these. Excuse me. And the interesting thing about these models is also that it helps us sort of create a timeline of the different shapes and design changes that happen over the years in the history of sailing ships. The fact of the existence of these models from the Bombay Dockyard also help us sort of like establish a kind of identifying corpus of ship styles in the absence of the existence of actual ships, or even in the absence of the existence of a lot of documentation on these ships. And finally, the last model that I'll show is the Cornwallis. There are a lot of other models that I viewed, but I thought that these would be the most interesting to show. This is a model that I had mentioned before, and we know who made this model because the person who made it engraved his name at the bottom. It was made by sorry, it was like, so the ship itself was made by Jamsetjee Bomanjee, and the model was made by his son, and it's assumed that it was currently constructed alongside the actual ship, but we don't know that for sure. These kinds of things are like a little difficult to put exact dates on unless a model maker decides to put a date on it, and they did not do that. But we do know that it was built by Naroji Jamsetjee Bomanjee's son, because he put his signature on the underside of the coach house of the roof. The copper sheathing of the hull, which prevents weed growth and damage by maritime mollusks, was later added to illustrate the size and pattern of application, and is currently on display in the National Maritime Museum, submerged in a little pool of water to show how it would have been in the sea. So as you can probably tell, I'm at a very preliminary stage of my research of looking into these objects and formulating an understanding of what they tell me about the history of shipbuilding at the Bombay Dockyard. It is a little fragmentary, and there's a lot of like visual thinking that needs to be done. I am not an art historian by profession, but I feel like I have gained a lot from the discipline of art history in trying to understand the history of these of shipbuilding by looking at these material objects. And I would be very happy to discuss further with all of you who are engaged with art history related work, who are engaged in museum professions, on the kind of direction that you feel like this project could go in. I'd be very happy to take questions, and I thank you so much for your time and your patience and for having me here and giving me an audience. Thank you.